Chapter 9 of 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter by Elliott O'Donnell. Chapter 9 Night Ramblings on Wimbledon Common and Hounds Low Heath. If there are any places in London that should be more haunted than others, assuredly those places are the parks and commons. When I was living on the south side of the river, I spent many nights tramping about Wimbledon, Clapham, Wandsworth, Tooting, and Streatham Commons. Since then I have lived at Blackheath, Hampstead, Hounds Low, and Dulwich, so that I may say I know pretty nearly every inch of these places. I can see myself now standing on Wimbledon Common close to a pool in the dead of night, no one about, and the reflection of the moon staring at me from the unruffled surface of the water. I am trying to get impressions of any event that may have taken place there. I got none. Suddenly a hand falls on my shoulder. I swing round, and peering into my face is the white, haggard face of a tramp. "You ain't going to drown yourself, are you?" he said. "Why?" I asked, anticipating a severe rebuke from this withered and worn scarecrow of humanity. "Why," he said, "because don't do it here. I can show you a much better spot where the water is deep, and where, when once you get in, you can't very easily get out." "But how will that benefit you?" I inquired, wondering why he was so eager. "You can let me have your clothes, can't you?" he explained. "You won't want to take them with you into the next world. From what I hears about it, spirits don't need neither coats nor trousers, and the few shillings I shall get for them will do me a bit of good, and won't hurt you." "But I wasn't contemplating suicide," I remarked. "I'm not tired of life yet." "Ain't you?" he said in extremely disappointed tones. "Then why are you out here at this time of night?" "If it comes to that," I observed, "why are you?" "I ain't got nowhere else to go," he said, "and there are no police out here to disturb anyone." "Nor ghosts?" I remarked. "Ghosts!" he chuckled. "I'm not afraid of ghosts. I shall soon be one myself, I expect. But there is one spot here I don't go near after dark." "Why?" "Why," he said, "come along with me, and maybe you'll guess." Had he been anything like my size, I should not have gone, for his appearance was very far from assuring, but as he was a small man, I felt comparatively safe. We walked side by side over the grass, crossed a gleaming white path, and steering in a slightly northerly direction—I could tell that much by the stars—abruptly halted in front of a shallow pit, on the other side of which was a big bush. "It's there," he said, pointing at the pit. "I've tried to sleep there twice, and each time I've been woken up by hearing something heavy fall close to my head. It seems to come from the bush. It's the bush that skeers me," he added, "and though I don't mind passing it in the daytime, nothing on earth will persuade me to look behind it after dark." "Not even sixpence?" I said, fingering that coin in my waistcoat pocket. "Go on," he said. "You haven't sixpence, otherwise you'd not be here. You're joking. If anyone really did offer me sixpence now to do it, well, I don't say but what I mightn't try." He spoke so hungrily and looked so famished that I decided to part with it, though sixpence to me just then had a particularly real value. I showed it him. "Look behind that tree," I said, "and I'll give it you." He set off at once. "No," I called out, "that won't do. You must go through the pit." He proceeded to obey, and was in the middle of the hollow, when I distinctly heard something very heavy strike the ground apparently close to him. I ran round the bush just in time to see what I thought was a black shadow shoot across the ground and disappear in a neighbouring clump of trees. When I returned, the tramp was still in the pit, but I could see nothing there to account for the noise. "Well," he said, "did you hear it?" "I heard something," I replies, "and there's your sixpence." I often went to Wimbledon Common afterwards, but never again saw the tramp, nor found the hollow. My Blackheath and Greenwich Park experiences, or at least most of them, are narrated fully in my Haunted Houses of London, so that I can only refer briefly to them here. From the impressions I got when walking on the common at Blackheath, I shall always believe that the superphysical influences there are particularly demoralizing. It always seemed to me that Blackheath, by the way, a curiously appropriate name, might be the rendezvous of the very worst type of earth-bound phantasms of the dead, and of the most vicious neutrarians. After leaving London and entering on my scholastic career, I was first of all a master at Daventry, then tutor in an Irish family at Aldershot, and then, in succession, a master in preparatory schools at Wandsworth, Hereford, and Blackheath. Of these various posts, I liked that at Blackheath the least, partly because the headmaster there was the most unmitigated snob, and my pupils hopelessly spoilt, and partly because I had such a detestation of the heath after dark. My only consolation in those days was cricket and writing. Every evening, after my work with the boys was done, I repaired to a room over a library in Blackheath village, and it was there that I completed my first novel, For Satan's Sake. The book deals with the soul of a suicide, and was based, as I have already stated, on my experiences in America and York Road, Lambeth. I tried it with various publishers, but without success, and it was not until 6 years later, when I was living in a small fishing town in Cornwall, that I eventually got it taken. It so happened that a well-known novelist came to see me one day, and when I told him that I had attempted a book, he said he would like to see it. I fished it out of the box, where it had lain undisturbed for years, and he went off with it, subsequently showing it to a reader of a publishing firm, also a well-known novelist, who was staying in the town at the time, and who was so impressed with it that he advised his firm to accept it. It did not even then come out for over a year, and the anxiety of awaiting my debut as an author can better be imagined than described. The success I prayed for was not showered upon me, but the book was well received on the whole, and paved the way for other works to follow. And now, let me hie back to London and its commons. Though Hampstead has, in all probability, its share of phantasms, my impressions there have been of a more agreeable nature than at Blackheath. I spent the greater part of several consecutive nights one summer sitting on a bench in a very rustic glade on the heath, waiting for anything that might happen. Once or twice between 1 and 2, something seemed to be making a violent effort to materialize, and I fully expected to see a figure suddenly appear before me. My impressions were that it would be the figure of a woman, and that she would be carrying a white bundle in her arms. I felt that she was in great trouble, and wanted to ask me for advice. I associated her worries with a big house that used to stand somewhere near the summit of Hampstead Hill. I felt all this very acutely, and I used to repeat aloud my willingness to do anything I could to assist her. Strange to say, a few years later, I met a lady who told me that she had had a curious experience in the same spot. She was walking through it rather late one autumn evening, accompanied by her dog, a big black retriever. When she came to the seat where I used to sit, the dog started barking and showed signs of great terror. Somewhat alarmed, she was about to hurry on, when a voice close to her said, "It's only me, Winifred. Don't be frightened. The boat I sailed in to America was wrecked, and only the child was saved." The lady looked round, but there was no one in sight. On reaching home, she mentioned the incident to her mother, who exclaimed in astonishment, "Well, that is odd! I was sitting on a seat, I should think in that very spot, about 40 years ago. We were living on Haverstock Hill at the time. when a letter was brought me announcing the loss of a big sailing vessel in the Atlantic, on which my maid, Winnie as we used to call her, had sailed with her husband to America. Only a very few of the passengers and crew survived, and Winnie and her husband were both drowned, but I never knew they had a child. Hounslow Heath should teem with ghosts, for it once swarmed with footpads, who, after committing every conceivable act of violence on and around the heath, usually ended their career there on gibbets. I once had rooms near the Bath Road, and spent many nights rambling about the heath in quest of ghostly adventure. One evening I kept fancying I was followed everywhere by a tall, muffled figure, and when in alarm I hastened over the grass onto the roadway, I heard a low, cynical laugh. All the way home the steps seemed to pursue me, and when I got into bed and prepared to blow out the light, I saw the curtains by the window rustle and swell out, as if someone was behind them. It was a long time before I ventured to blow out the light, and when I slept, I dreamed a dark hooded figure was bending over me. On another occasion, as I perambulated the heath, where the trees were thickly clustered and the undergrowth had become the densest tangle, I caught a glimpse of two men playing dice. I heard their laughter and the rattling of the box as they shook it in the air and threw out the dice. Then suddenly their gaiety was turned to wrath. There were oaths and blows, cries and groans, and all became silent, save for the soughing and moaning of the wind through the lofty tree-tops. But as I came away from the heath, there was again that cynical laugh, and again footsteps seemed to follow me home, and again the curtain by the window of my room shook and swelled. I did not go to the heath one night. I lay awake in bed instead, and about the hour I had usually returned, I heard steps, long swinging steps, coming down the little side road towards the house. My memory at once went back to that night in Dublin, and I strained my ears to catch the accompanying sound. I had not long to wait. It soon came, the same old familiar click, click, click. In an agony of fear lest the steps should stop at the house and there should be a repetition of the terrible knocking at the door, I lighted a candle and sat up. Nearer and nearer they came, and then, when I felt certain they would stop, to my infinite relief they went on. On past the house, the echoes ringing out loud and clear in the keen, frosty air, until they reached the Bath Road. I fully expected some misfortune would happen to me after this occurrence, as the last time I had heard the steps had been at the time of my failure to pass the medical for the RIC, and shortly before my disastrous trip to America. Yet nothing of a specially untoward nature happened. Apparently, the steps on this occasion merely heralded another change in my vocation, for I shortly afterwards became imbued with the desire to be an actor, and commenced what was destined to be a lively, though very brief, theatrical career, as a pupil in the Henry Neville Studio, Oxford Street. Before, however, passing on to subsequent events, I must relate one other, the only other ghostly happening I experienced at Hounslow. In a remote corner of the heath there was one spot that had a peculiar fascination for me, and whenever I returned from it, I dreamed the same dream, that a beautiful girl in an old-world costume, with fair hair, large blue eyes, and daintily moulded lips, approached my bed and leaned over me. She had the most appealing expression in her face, and seemed to be anxious to make me her confidant. I was always about to address her, when some extraordinary metamorphosis took place, and I awoke palpitating with terror. The dream greatly impressed me, and I tried my best to discover a reason for it. I did eventually, but not until the year I published Some Haunted Houses of England and Wales, when I got into correspondence with a very old lady, whom I will call Miss Carmichael. Miss Carmichael lived at Ealing, close to the parish church, and wrote to me to the effect that, if I liked to call on her, she could tell me a curious tale about an old house that used to stand on the outskirts of Hounslow Heath. Of course, I accepted this invitation. I found Miss Carmichael, when I called, lying on a sofa, crippled with rheumatism, but otherwise in the full possession of all her senses, and wonderfully vivacious, despite the fact that she was well over 90. "The house I want to tell you about," she said, "was called the Gables. It was a large, old-fashioned manor house with very extensive grounds, and at the beginning of the last century it belonged to my aged relative, Miss Denning. She never lived in it herself, but she kept it in excellent repair, and at her death, in or about 1820, her nephew inherited an apparently valuable property. Now, Tom Denning had a great friend, Dick Mayhew, and it was from Dick Mayhew, who was also a great friend of mine, that I heard the most detailed accounting of the hauntings. I will try and tell you the story just as my friend told it to me. I was sitting in my stuffy office in Jermyn Street one spring morning when who should suddenly walk in but Tom Denning, whom I had not seen for some time. "Why, Dick," he said, "how fagged and run down you look. A spell in the country is what you need. It would do you all the good in the world. Supposing you come down to my place at Hounslow and have a blow on the heath. I keep a couple of horses, and you can ride all day if you like." "What surprises you spring on one," I ejaculated. "I didn't know you were living so near London, and at Hounslow, too. Aren't you afraid of highwaymen? I hear they still visit the place occasionally. How long have you been there?" "I haven't been there yet," Dick replied with a laugh. "At least, not to stay. The property has just been left me by my aunt. It's a queer old house, just the kind of place a romantic beggar like you would like, and if any house ought to be haunted, it ought. They say a murder was once committed there by an ancestress of mine, a girl whose face was as beautiful as she herself was evil, and that her spirit still roams the house and grounds." "I should certainly like to see her," I said, "and so, I am sure, would Greg." Greg was Dick's bloodhound. "Well, I'll give you both an opportunity," Tom laughed. "Take Greg with you, and a friend too, if you like, for I may not be able to join you at once." I accepted, and in due course arrived at the Gables, accompanied by my cousin Ralph, who was then a lieutenant in the Buffs, and Greg. The grounds surrounding the Gables, which stood near the edge of the heath, were encompassed by a very high, red brick wall, and consisted of a broad, well-kept lawn in front, a small spinney on one side, an extensive shrubbery on the other, and big kitchen gardens at the back. The house itself, 17th century, and covered with ivy from tip to toe, was picturesque in the extreme. There were no servants, only the caretakers, a middle-aged man and his wife, who occupied rooms in the east wing. The west wing was reserved for us. After dinner, in a hall so enormous that it made us feel positively Lilliputian, we wandered out into the garden. It was a glorious night, the sky one mass of silver, scintillating stars, the air redolent with the odour of spring flowers. "By Jove," Ralph remarked to me as we strolled across the lawn, "by Jove, no one would think we were so close to that God-forsaken heath. Why, it was only a few years ago that a fellow in my regiment was set on there, and after being robbed of all he had on him, half beaten to death with bludgeons. It's one of the worst cutthroat spots round London." Then he uttered an exclamation of surprise and jogged my elbow. Coming towards us from the house was the figure of a young girl. She wore a white dress with a dark cloak flung loosely over her shoulders, and the moonlight playing over her face revealed a countenance of extraordinary delicacy and beauty. Her eyes were large and childlike in their expression, her lips daintily modelled, her teeth wonderfully white and even, her hair golden. Whether it was the effect of the moonlight on them or not I cannot say, but her cheeks were absolutely devoid of colour, almost strikingly pale, whilst I fancied I detected in the slightly open mouth an expression of pain. I saw every detail most distinctly, even to the shape of her fingers, which were very pointed. She came on without apparently noticing us, and we watched her trip past us and disappear in the spinney. "What a stunner!" Ralph exclaimed. "I don't know when I've seen a prettier face. Sly fellow, Denning. I wonder who she can be." He had hardly finished speaking when we heard the most awful scream, a shriek of terror and despair, such as sent all the blood in my body to my heart, and left the rest of me like ice. "My God, what's happened to her?" Ralph gasped. "She's being murdered! Quick!" We dashed into the spinney, but despite the fact that we searched everywhere, no girl was to be found. Returning to the house, we made enquiries of the caretakers, who were vehement in their denial of knowing the girl or of having heard her cries. Much puzzled, we then retired to our night quarters. The room that had been assigned to us, for we preferred to share one between us, was situated about midway down a long, narrow corridor, lighted at the further end by a casement window, across which sprays of ivy blew to and fro in the cool breeze. For a long time we sat in front of the fire chatting, but at 1 o'clock Ralph got up and exclaimed it was high time we turned into bed. "Hullo, look at Greg," he said, pointing to the dog, who was crouching on the floor in front of the door, showing its teeth in a series of savage growls. "What's the matter with him?" Before I had time to reply, we suddenly heard a regular measured tap, 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 as of high-heeled shoes coming along the corridor towards our door. "That can't be either the caretaker or his wife," Ralph whispered. "I wonder if it's the young lady. Perhaps she's going to pay us a surreptitious visit. I only wish she would, the little darling." Nearer and nearer came the steps, until they seemed to stop just outside our door. Greg's hair bristled, he gave a deep growl, and retreated halfway across the room. Then there came a loud knock on the door, followed by the sound of a violent scuffle. Springing forward, Ralph threw the door wide open. There was nothing there, only the cold light of the moon and the white, motionless faces of the Demings' ancestors hanging on the walls. "It's deuced odd," Ralph said. "I swear I heard steps and a knock, and yet there's nothing to account for it. Could it have been rats?" "I don't think so," I said. "Rats wouldn't have frightened Greg. Look at him now. He is quite recovered." Greg had come to my side and was licking my hand and wagging his tail. In the morning, I asked the caretaker's wife if the place was haunted. Haunted?" she stammered. "No. Whatever made you think of such a thing, sir? There ain't no such things as ghosts. It's them howls you heard." Seeing there was nothing to be got out of her, Ralph and I did not refer to the subject again, but spent our time reading in the library and wandering about the heath. In the evening, we sauntered out into the garden and tried to coax Greg to come with us, but he resolutely refused, and so we had to leave him behind. Just about the same time as on the previous evening, and in identically the same place, we again saw the girl. "I'll speak to her, hanged if I don't," Ralph muttered, and taking off his hat, he stepped forward and accosted her. Without apparently perceiving us, she passed resolutely on, and, entering the spinney, was speedily lost to sight. Almost directly afterwards, the same awful wailing scream rose shrill and high on the still night air. This time we did not rush after her, but walking hurriedly back to the house, we sought the companionship of the bright and cheery fireside. At 1 o'clock we were again seated in our bedroom, and the events of the preceding night were repeated in every detail. On the morrow Tom joined us. When we told him of the ghost, he became intensely interested. "It must be my ancestress," he said. "The girl who was supposed to have murdered somebody. I'll sit up with you two fellows tonight, and we'll have the door open." After dinner we all three went into the garden. "It's here we first caught sight of her," Ralph exclaimed, as we halted on the lawn. "Here, and precisely at this hour. Yes, by Jove, and there she is." I looked, and there was the figure I knew so well, tripping daintily towards us, her yellow hair and silver shoe buckles gleaming furiously in the moonlight. "She wears a hood," Tom cried, "and it completely hides her face." "What?" Ralph retorted. "She has no hood, you must be dreaming." As before, the girl passed us, and we lost sight of her amongst the trees. The next moment, and we again heard her scream. Then we searched everywhere, but with no result. She was certainly not on the premises, and as there was no avenue of escape save by scaling a 10-foot wall, we could only conclude she had melted into fine air. In other words, vanished. "I'll get to the bottom of this mystery," Tom growled between his teeth, "if I root up every tree in the garden." "What you've seen so far," Ralph observed, "is only the prelude. There's more to come, and I'm not sure if Act 2 is not the most exciting. What do you think, Dick?" "Ask Greg," I replied. "I believe he knows more about it than we do." On arriving indoors, we all three retired to the bedroom we had agreed to share. The night was so exquisite that I sat by the open window. Directly beneath me was the gravel drive, which lay like a broad white belt encircling the house, and beyond it, on the level sweep of lawn, danced the shadows from the larch and fir trees in the paddock. The only sign of life came from the bats and night birds that wheeled and skimmed in silent flight in and out the bushes. There was very little breeze, sufficient only to make the ivy rustle, and the window in the corridor outside give the faintest perceptible jar. I gazed at my companions. Ralph lay on the sofa sound asleep. a half-serious, half-amused look on his handsome features, while Tom sat in an armchair directly in front of the fire, his head buried in the palms of his hands, as if wrapped in profound thought. A distant church clock boomed 1. Greg growled, and Tom, at once springing up, flung the door widely back on its hinges. "There," he said, "come what may, we're ready for it." As he concluded, there came a tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Someone in high-heeled shoes was walking over the polished oak boards of the corridor in our direction. To me there was a world of stealth and cautiousness in the sounds that suggested a host of conflicting motives. As the steps drew nearer, the door suddenly swung to with a loud crash, and before we had time to recover from our astonishment, someone rapped. With a shout of baffled rage, Tom leaped to his feet and tore at the handle. The massive door at once flew open. The corridor was empty. Only moonbeams and pictures, nothing more. The following day was wet, and we stayed indoors all the morning and afternoon reading. As it cleared up a little toward supper time, Tom proposed going for a short walk. We slipped on our overcoats and were crossing the big entrance hall to the front door, when Tom suddenly exclaimed, "Hang it, I've left my pipe upstairs. I say, wait a minute, you fellows, till I get it." He started running, and then stopped short, giving vent to a loud exclamation. Ascending the broad staircase in front of us was a form, whose back view exactly resembled that of the golden-haired beauty we had seen in the garden. Where she had sprung from we could not say. We only knew she was there. "By Jove, I'll see her face this time," Tom said. "I'll see it even if I have to force her to turn around." He ran after her, and, mounting the stairs 2 at a time, stretched out his hand to pluck at her sleeve. She turned, and her face was to us a blank. What Tom saw we never knew. Shouting, "Take the damned thing away from me!" he stepped back and fell, and when we ran forward, we found him lying at the foot of the stairs, dead. The property, Miss Carmichael informed me, passed to a distant relative, who, after trying in vain to let it, pulled it down. The ghost, it was rumoured, was that of a very beautiful ancestress of the Dennings, who, after leading a life evil even for those times, disappeared. What happened to her material body no one ever knew, but her spirit was supposed to haunt the house and grounds in dual form. To the stranger, that is to say, to those outside her own family, she appeared in all the radiant beauty of her earthly body, but to the Dennings she seldom revealed her face. When she did, they beheld something too terrible for the mind to conceive and live. "I have heard," Miss Carmichael added, "that the ghost has been seen quite recently haunting the site once occupied by the house and grounds, and also the borders of the heath." And as Miss Carmichael was very emphatic on this last point, I may not unreasonably conclude that the girl of my dreams was the actual ghost of the Gables. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter by Elliott O'Donnell. Chapter 10. My Views on a Future Life for the Animal and Vegetable Worlds. I mentioned in one of my former works that I believe many of the figures we pass by in the streets are not men and women like ourselves, but phantasms. phantasms of the living, that is to say, spirit projections of people consciously or unconsciously thinking of being where we see them, phantasms of the dead, and impersonating neutrarians. Mingling with the crowds in the parks and gliding in and out the trees, I have often seen people with the pallor of corpses. I have followed them, and they have unaccountably vanished. I believe Hyde Park, particularly the northern side, to be as full of ghosts as any spot in London, and I have heard many strange tales from the outcasts, the tattered and torn brigade, who have slept all night under its trees and bushes. The police are, I believe, expected to clear the park before locking up time, and I've no doubt they try to do so, but they cannot possibly look into every nook and cranny in that vast expanse, and there are many in which one could easily hide and defy detection. I have tried the experiment once, and I am not anxious to try it again. There is no place so terribly depressing, so strangely suggestive of suicide, and hauntings by the most grotesque type of neutrarians, as London's premier park by night. Some 12 or 15 years ago, in my nightly rambles there, I noticed that the seat beneath a certain tree, midway between the Marble Arch and Lancaster Gate, was rarely occupied, whereas all the other seats in that vicinity were invaded by couples. One evening, the weather being warm and sultry, I went and sat there. I dozed off, and eventually fell into a deep sleep. I dreamed that an old man and a young girl stood under the tree whispering, and that as I watched them they raised their eyes and looked in a horribly guilty manner, not at me, but at the space next me, which I perceived for the first time was occupied by a tiny child. Moving stealthily forward and holding in their hands an outspread cloth, they crept up behind the child, the cloth descended, and all three vanished. Then something made me gaze up into the branches of the tree, and I saw a large, light, colourless, heavily lidded eye peering down at me with an expression of the most utmost malevolence. It was altogether so baneful, so symbolic of cruelty, malice, and hate, that I could only stare back at it in mute astonishment. The whole shape of the tree then seemed to alter, and to become like an enormous dark hand, which, swaying violently to and fro, suddenly dived down and closed over me. I awoke at once, and was so afraid of seeing the eye, that for some minutes I kept my own eyes tightly shut. When I opened them, I saw, bending over me, a very white face, and to my intense relief, a voice, unmistakably human, croaked, "No wonder you're scared, sitting here at this time of night by yourself." The speaker was merely one of the many hundreds of tramps for whom the park was reception and bedroom combined. His hat was little more than a rim, and his trousers cried shame on the ladies I saw every day with their skirts plastered all over with buttons. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes preternaturally bright, and his breath full of hunger. Still, he was alive, and anything alive just then was very welcome. "I never sleep here," he said. "None of us do." "Why?" I asked. "Because it's haunted," he said. "You may laugh. So did I years ago, before I took to this sort of thing. But sleeping out of doors all night has taught me more than any politicians, bishops, or schoolmasters know, or any of those fine ladies that swell about in their carriages know. I've seen sights that would make an angel afraid. I've seen ghosts of all sorts. They're not all like us, neither. Some of them ain't human at all. They're devils. You may laugh when you read about them in them library books, but it's no laughing matter when you see them, as I've seen them, all alone and cold in some wayside ditch. This tree, I tell you, is haunted, and it's a devil that haunts it. Ask my mates, any of them that you'll find sleeping in the parks. There's many of them that have experienced it. They've seen something hiding in the branches, and when they've seen it, they've felt they must either kill themselves or someone else. There's a devil in the tree that tempts one to do all kind of wicked things, and if you take my advice, young man, you'll sit somewhere else." "I think I will," I said, "and here's something for your warning." I gave him threepence, the only coins I had on me just then, and, overwhelming me with thanks, he shuffled away. Since that night I have often thought that the poor, the very poor, know far more of the other world or worlds than do the rich, and that they know more, far more, on other points than the rich. The statesman talks of the people and the people's needs, but what does he know of the people and their needs? He rarely, if ever, goes amongst them. Except in electioneering times, I doubt if any member of Parliament ever goes into the more squalid of our London districts. I have seen one member of the House of Lords eating whelks in a tavern in the Limehouse Causeway, but he is an exception. Journalists go there, but the leisured folk never. It bores them, and yet how much they might learn, how much not only of urgent human needs, but of coming storms. They might learn that the East End brews whilst the West End sleeps, and that as surely as the long-talked-of German war cloud, that war cloud they affected to ridicule, has at last burst, so undoubtedly will the war cloud of revolution hatched by malcontents of all nationalities in East End doss-houses and crowded coffee taverns. This is no empty prophecy. The cinders of the volcano have been hot for some time. They are now burning hot, and the hour is fast approaching when they will arise mightily in a red conflagration. Are we prepared for it? It takes a very sound constitution to face a revolution with perfect confidence. Are we sound? Can any constitution be sound when the rich daily go richer and the poor poorer? Where art, all that cries out for beauty, real beauty, beauty as it is seen and worshipped by souls uninspired by lucre, is starved to death and crushed, limp and lifeless, by the thumbscrews of a vain, shallow, mercenary mushroom aristocracy on the one hand, and an equally selfish, crude, ignorant, money-grabbing working class on the other. But let me say again, it is the East End, the ever-watchful, never-slumbering East End, that is the thermometer of future events. And why? Because it is here that the lean, hungry men of letters, who seldom if ever get their thoughts transferred to print, are even now threshing out the nation's destiny. Threshing it out, consolidating it, whilst the moneyed men and women, the present all-powerful nouveau riche, the beer, whiskey, and tobacco, peers and peeresses, the lords of the stock exchange, banks, and divorce courts, those who have made their money out of the sins and follies of the world, or by sweating and usury, are lolling in their soft, upholstered chairs, smoking luxurious cigars and quaffing liqueurs. The war has done much. It has aroused patriotism. It has given rise to self-sacrifice, but it has not touched the root of the gangrene. It has not lessened our worship of the dollar. Individualism, as we know it today, must collapse, and some better and purer system, a system that does not encourage selfishness, must prevail. The people are dying for change, for some great change that will give them fair play. This is the people's need, the need that you may hear voiced throughout the length and breadth of the squalid East End. We want a government that remembers its primary duties, they cry. A government that is father to its children, that loves, fosters, and protects them. We have never had one yet, but the hour may not be far distant when we shall demand one. This is what the people of leisure might learn if they visited the haunts I visit, and they might learn more beside. They might learn of another world, a spirit world, such as is never alluded to in the pulpits, with which people in the poorest parts, people who are too poor to pay for beds, are forced to live in contact. Nights in the parks and commons have taught these vagrants more, 1,000 times more, than they ever learned in Sunday or county council schools. They have seen sights spirits in the form of man and of beast, of both and of neither, that have revealed to them how closely the other world borders on this, and to what close supervision the inhabitants of the other world subject some of us. They have learned, I say, what no priest or preacher would or could teach them, namely, that the hell of spirit land lies on this earth, and that the worst of all punishments is that of the poor phantasms of the dead that glides in and out the trees nocturnally, never meeting those it knew and loved, but ever encountering the most terrifying of the spirits that are hostile to man. Our vagrants know, too, the power of these neutrarians. They know they can adopt any shape and tempt and goad man on to the committal of any crime, however heinous. They have, moreover, acquired a further knowledge, a knowledge denied and scoffed at by the ministry of all Christian denominations, namely that all forms of animal and vegetable life, all forms of flora and fauna, pass into the superphysical and live again. I myself first learned of a tree ghost from an old tramp, who came and sat by my side on a seat on Clapham Common. "Do I ever see anything strange here at night?" he repeated in answer to my question. "Yes, I do, at times. But what gives me the worst fright is a tree that I sometimes see close to the spot where that man was murdered some 10 or 12 years ago. I never saw it before the murder, but a few nights afterwards, as I was passing the spot, I saw a peculiar glimmer of white, and on getting a bit closer, I found, to my astonishment, that it was a tall, slender, white thing with branches just like a tree, only it was not behaving like a tree. Although there was not a breath of wind, it kept lurching with a strange creaking noise, and I felt it was watching me furtively, just as if it had eyes, and was bent on doing me all the harm it possibly could. I was so scared, I turned tail and never ceased running till I had reached home. "Home?" I said. "Yes, a clump of bushes near the ditch, where I always turn in of nights. It ain't much of a home, to be sure, but it's the only one I've got, and I can generally count on lying there undisturbed till the morning." I gave him a few coppers, and he blessed me as if I had given him a fortune. On Tooting Common, I met a Northumberland miner, who had come to London for the first time on a holiday, and, having had his pocket picked, was obliged to spend the night out of doors. "Ghosts," he said, when I asked him if he had any experiences with the supernatural whilst engaged in his underground work. "Ghosts, yes, but of a nature you don't read about in books. Me and my mates, when working in a drift at night, have heard the blowing of the wind and a mighty rustling of leaves, and have found ourselves surrounded on all sides by numerous trees and ferns that have suddenly risen from the ground and formed a regular forest. They have not resembled any trees you see nowadays, but what you might fancy existed many thousands of years ago. There has been no colour in them, only a uniform whiteness, and they have shone like phosphorus. We have heard, too, all the noises, such as go on daily in forests above ground, the humming and buzzing of insects, and the chirping of birds, and shafts and galleries have echoed and re-echoed with the sounds, till you would have thought that those away above us must have heard them too." I do not think the miner romanced, for what he said was only a corroboration of what other miners have often told me. Of course it is not every mine that is haunted in this way, or every miner that sees such sights, for the unknown confines its manifestations to the few, but I firmly believe such phenomena do happen, because, as I state in my Byways of Ghostland, published by W. Ryder and Sons, I have seen several tree ghosts myself. If one form of life possesses a spirit, why should we not assume that other forms of life possess a spirit too? Why should man have the monopoly of an immaterial self, and alone of all creation continue his identity after physical dissolution? On moral grounds? No, for man, generally speaking, is in no sense superior morally to the so-called beasts around him. He is often the reverse. Oddly enough, we have so long accustomed ourselves to using the term immorality exclusively in reference to our illegal relations with the other sex, that we have come to regard these illegal relations as the only immorality existing. It is a curious error. Immorality comprises theft, and theft not only comprehends depriving people of their material goods, it comprehends slander and gossip, i.e., depriving people of their character, sweating, i.e., depriving people of the just rewards of their mental and manual labor, and bread snatching, i.e., depriving people of their only means of existence, besides many other acts of an equally odious nature. The average drawing room is invariably the rendezvous of immoral people. 9 out of every 10 of the ladies one meets there are robbers. They steal, almost at very breath, someone's good name and reputation, a far worse crime than the purloining of a loaf, for which act of desperation a poor man would be sent to prison, and a hungry dog beaten. In the drawing room, too, one meets the girl with a few hundred a year, who announces her intention of taking some post, maybe on the stage, or on the staff of some paper, or in a business house, just to make a little money. A little money at the expense of someone else's life. For that is what the want of occupation to the person with no private income literally means. We see none of this mean immorality in the animal world. Dogs steal bones from one another, it is true, but they do not lie, and cheat, and intrigue, nor do they, when they have a sufficiency themselves, snatch away the little that constitutes another person's all. Animals are accused of being cruel, of barbarously murdering one another, as in the cases of the cat and mouse, the lion and deer, etc. But they rarely kill, saving when they are hungry, and for food man kills too, in a fashion and with a method which is truly disgusting. By studiously looking after the daily wants of certain animals, such as cows and sheep, and by caring for them when they are ill, man leads them to suppose he is their friend, and they learn to trust him. Vain faith! He is kind to them only to suit his own ends. He outjudases Judas, and after nonchalantly accepting their most lavish tributes of affection, he takes them unawares and kills them, either with a pole-axe or some other weapon entailing an equally painful and lingering death. Do any animals behave quite so basely? Besides, there is no cruelty in the animal world. Not even the most excruciating suction of the octopus, nor the sharp, agonizing bite of the flesh-eating parrot of New Zealand, that can for one moment compare with the coolly planned and leisurely executed horrors of the Spanish Inquisition. And the tiger, at its worst, is but a tyro in savagery compared with the creature God is said to have made in his own image. From vices, turn to virtues, and pause for a moment in reflection on the many lovable qualities of the dog. Where in man do we find such affection, forgiveness, general amiability, constancy, and patience, and in the case of the horse, such a willingness to labor without any thought of recompense? It makes me positively ill when I hear hopelessly immoral men and women, gossips, slanderers, bread snatchers, usurers, sweaters, speak condescendingly of animals, of dogs and horses that are on an infinitely higher moral plane than ever they have been or ever will be. But moral superiority is not the only superiority that man fallaciously assumes. He lays claim to an intellectual superiority, which is equally fallacious, equally a myth. No one who has ever studied animal and insect life can but have been impressed with the marvels of ingenuity and skill displayed therein. The web of the common garden spider and the nest of the wren, for example, are every whit as wonderful in their way as the architectural works of Inigo Jones or Christopher Wren. On the grounds of a moral and mental inferiority, therefore, the argument of a future life for the human species only fails. Another argument, an argument advanced by the most bigoted of the religious denominationalists, is that man only has a conscience, and that conscience which he alone possesses is the only passport to another world. Without conscience there can be no soul, and without soul there can be no hope of a continuation of life after death. This, of course, is merely assumption, as is nearly all the teaching of the churches. Conscience, like religion, depends to a very large extent on climate. A man born in the center of Africa might not think it wrong to do things that would appear appalling to a Plymouth brother, and vice versa. There is at present no fixed and universal standard of right and wrong, any more than there is a fixed and universal standard of beauty. For as each eye forms its own idea of feminine loveliness, so each heart forms its own conception of honor and dishonor, virtue and vice. We know that this is the case as far as mankind is concerned, and we have nothing beyond assumption to assure us that it is not so throughout the animal and insect world. If the animals have no conception of a moral standard, how is it that they do not destroy one another? That the instinct to injure people is innate in us is readily proved by the joy nearly all of us take in saying disparaging things of our neighbors. We go so far, and we would undoubtedly go the whole hog and kill those we hate, if something more, perhaps, than the mere fear of hanging did not hold us back. That restraining something is unquestionably the fear of the future, and it is that fear which I am inclined to think is the origin of what we term our consciences. Were we sure there was no future existence, there would be no moral restraint. It would only be the prospect of legal punishment that would deter us from injuring other people to our heart's content. We should have no consciences, and if this is applicable to mankind, why is it not applicable to other forms of animal life? Is it not feasible to suppose that it is this same fear of the future that acts as a preventive to animals killing one another indiscriminately? That they do at times rob and kill for other motives than to satisfy their hunger is indisputable. But these exceptional cases prove what I am trying to maintain, that there is some restraining influence that keeps the vast majority highly moral, and I see no feasible arguments for not supposing this influence to be a conscience begat by a deep-rooted fear of what may await them on physical dissolution. And if this applies to the mammals, why not to the whole animal, insect, and vegetable worlds? To everything that has life, for science has yet to prove that where there is life there is not also intelligence. The superior morality of animals to man, then, may be considered as due to their more powerful consciences, and to their stronger fear of the possibility of the superphysical. And why should they have a much stronger fear? Because, unquestionably, they have a more intimate knowledge of the unknown than has man. No one who has had much to do with dogs and horses can doubt this. Who that has ridden through woods and jungles, or lonely country roads at night, has not seen their horse suddenly stop and evince every evidence of fear? Though the human eye has seen nothing to account for it, the horse obviously has seen something, and it has only been by dint of the utmost coaxing and petting that the sagacious animal has been persuaded to continue its course. It is the same with dogs. Over and over again I have had dogs with me in houses alleged to be haunted, and they have suddenly manifested symptoms of the greatest, the most uncontrollable fear. I have endeavored to pacify them, to urge them to follow me, but it has been in vain. Though obedient and fearless as a rule, they have suddenly become the most disobedient and incorrigible of cowards. Why? Because I am certain they have seen and heard things which, for some unaccountable reason, have been held back from me. If knowledge, then, of another life is any plea for the bestowal of an unperishable spirit, animals should live again even more surely than man. And so also should the vegetable world, for I have myself seen trees violently agitated, as if with paroxysms of the most sublime terror, before the advent of superphysical phenomena. And stronger than any of these arguments is that of the ghosts themselves. There are innumerable and well-authenticated cases of hauntings by the phantasms of dogs, horses, birds, insects, and trees, and it is perhaps chiefly through these hauntings that we can disprove the theory that man possesses a monopoly of the immaterial planes, a theory which, were it not for his insufferable egotism and conceit, he would never have advanced. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter by Elliott O'Donnell. Chapter 11. A Haunting in Regent's Park and My Further Views with Regard to Spiritualism. Before concluding my experiences in the parks and commons of London, I will cite one other case, a case which serves to illustrate the theme I have just been discussing. I was visiting the Zoological Gardens in Regent's Park one day in the summer of 1898, and was so struck with the look of yearning in the eyes of one of the lions, the desperate look of yearning to have just 5 minutes' gambol on the sunny lawn outside, 5 minutes in which to stretch its poor, cramped-up limbs, and sniff, perhaps for the first time, the fine fresh air of freedom, that I could not refrain from mentioning what was passing in my mind to a white-haired old man and a plainly dressed young woman who were standing near. "Yes, sir," the old man said, "it does seem hard on these huge animals to be confined within the limits of such a very small space, and to have to pace up and down these little boxes, tantalized by the sight of other creatures enjoying the privileges that are denied to them. It is worse treatment than any meted out to criminals. In fact, the biggest ruffian in jail does not suffer in anything like the same degree as these animals. They have one thing to be thankful for, however. Life cannot last forever. Death will be their kindest friend. It is the rich man's purgatory, but it is paradise for all these creatures as well as for the poor man." "You believe in another world, then?" I remarked. "Believe in another world?" he answered sharply. "Why, of course I do. I have seen far too much of it to do otherwise. Haven't I, Minnie?" "Yes, Grandad," the girl said simply. "We both have, Minnie and I," the old man went on. "Spirits?" I inquired. "Yes, spirits. Ghosts, if you like," he said. "Tell me, I'm not one of the scoffers," I pleaded. He looked at me searchingly and then said, "I used to be a keeper here many years ago. I was devoted to the animals, and when they died, I invariably saw their ghosts. So did some of the other keepers. Now, don't run away with the idea that the gardens are haunted, sir. As far as I know, they are not. It was only to us who had so much to do with them when they were alive that the spirits of these animals appeared. I remember one instance in particular, about 12 years ago, just before I left the zoo. A young lion came here from East Africa. It wouldn't let any of the keepers go near it excepting myself, and it was generally regarded as having a very uncertain temper. But I never found it so. I knew that the reason of its restlessness was its hatred of confinement. I knew it hated its cage, and I used to do all I could to comfort it. There was a sort of mutual understanding between us. When it saw me looking a bit anxious and worried, for my wife was often ill, it used to come and rub its great head against me, as if to cheer me up, and when I saw it looking more than usually dejected, I used to stop and talk to it for a longer time than I talked to any one of the other animals. Well, one day it fell ill, caught a chill, so we thought, and evinced a strong dislike to its food. I discussed its case with the other keepers, and they agreed there was nothing to be alarmed about, as it was young and to all appearances healthy. We all thought it would be well again in a few days. I had gone home as usual one night, and was sitting in the kitchen reading the evening paper, when something came over me that I must go for a walk. I told Minnie, who was a little girl then, not more than 9 or 10 years of age, and she begged her mother to let her go with me. We started off with the intention of going to the Caledonian Road, as Minnie liked looking at the shops there. But we hadn't gone far before Minnie suddenly exclaimed, "Grandad, let's go to Regent's Park." "Regent's Park?" I ejaculated. "Whatever do you want to go there for at this time of night?" "I don't know," she said, "but I feel I must." "Well, now," I replied, "that's odd, because the very same feeling has come over me." We struck off down Crowndale Road. I was living in the neighbourhood of the St. Pancras Road then, and got to Gloucester Gate just about dusk. We had passed through, and were walking along the broad walk by the side of the Zoo, when Minnie suddenly caught hold of my arm and said, "Look, Grandad." I followed the direction of her gaze, and there, coming straight towards us from the Zoo walls, was a lion. I can tell you it gave me a jump, as I naturally thought one of the animals had escaped. It aimed straight for us, and upon its getting close to, I recognized it at once. It was the young lion that had been taken ill. To my astonishment, however, there was nothing of the invalid about it now. The expression in its eyes was one of infinite happiness. It seemed to say, "I have attained my ideal. I am out in the open, in the sweet fresh air, and the wide darkness of the fast approaching night." It came right up to us, and I stretched out my hand to touch it, wondering what the passers-by would do when they saw it, and how on earth we should get it back into the gardens. It bitterly grieved me to think it would have to lose its freedom. I stretched out my hand, I say, to touch it, and to my surprise my fingers encountered nothing. The lion had vanished. I then realized what Minnie had known all along, that what we had seen was a ghost. A ghost, and yet it had appeared to me so absolutely real and lifelike. "How did you know it was a ghost?" I inquired of the young woman. "By the curious kind of light which seemed to emanate from all over its body," she replied. "I can only describe it as a kind of glow, something like that of a glowworm. It was not a bit natural." "But you saw the figure distinctly?" "Yes," she responded, "very distinctly, and I wasn't the least bit afraid." "Let me tell you the sequel, sir," the old man interrupted. "On my arrival at the Zoo in the morning, one of the men came running up to me. 'It's dead,' he said. 'Dead?' I cried. 'Who's dead?' 'Why, that young lion of yours,' was the reply. 'It died at 8 o'clock last night.' And, sure enough, when I went into the lion house, there was the animal lying stretched out at full length in its cage, dead. It had died at 8 o'clock, which was the exact time we had seen it in the park." And now to pursue the thread of my own life, which must of necessity run through this volume. While I was teaching at Blackheath, I not only completed my first novel, For Satan's Sake, but studied for the stage at the Henry Neville Studio in Oxford Street. I shall never forget with what joy, when my duties with the spoilt and tiresome boys were over, I exchanged the terrible monotony of the schoolroom for the delightful and interesting atmosphere of the studio. Henry Neville did not teach there himself, but periodically came to watch and help us with his criticisms, which were always as kindly and instructive as they were utterly free from pomposity and egotism. Easy and natural himself, he tried to infuse something of his spirit into us, and with many of us, I believe, he succeeded. For even those who did not believe that acting could be taught were bound to admit that the pupils of Henry Neville were singularly free from the staginess almost always seen in amateurs, and sometimes in professionals as well. Henry Neville's brother, Fred Gartside, who gave me my first lesson in elocution, an abler or more persevering instructor could not have been found, left off teaching at the studio soon after I joined. Mr. G.R. Foss took his place and is, I believe, still at the head of it. I have always looked upon G.R. Foss as one of the greatest stage geniuses I have ever met. He is that rarest of all individuals, the born actor, the man who can perform almost any role with equal success. He is the ideal stage manager, a past master in the knowledge of all the technicalities adhering to the theatre, and the possessor of a never-ceasing flow of wit and good humour. Among the pupils who were at the studio with me, several have performed in London. I toured with George Desmond, who was quite recently playing in the West End, and I met Miss Yvonne Orchardson again, some 2 or 3 years ago, when she was also acting in a London theatre, whilst I constantly see that charming and talented old Nevilleite, Miss Lillian North, who delights London audiences with her sweetly told stories and good recitations. Apart from any other personal attractions, Miss North has the most beautiful hands. The fingers are long and tapering, and the nails exquisitely shaped. It is the rarest combination of the psychic and dramatic hand, and such as I have very seldom seen, saving among Orientals. If I have spoken somewhat extravagantly of the Neville Studio, its instructors and pupils, it is only what I genuinely feel, and I repeat again, that the hours there were some of the most delightful I have ever experienced. When I had completed my course of instruction, I went on tour in A Night Out. I then came back to London and remained nearly a year in town, writing in the daytime and playing in one or other of the suburbs in the evening. I lived for the most part in St. James Road, Brixton, where I wrote my second and third books, both novels, and entitled respectively The Unknown Depths and Dinevah the Beautiful. The Unknown Depths, founded to a large extent upon my own life, introduces the subject of spiritualism, or as it is now more often termed, spiritism, and whilst I was engaged on it, I attended many séances. I am often asked to express an opinion on spiritualism. I am very averse from any attempt to invoke spirits either through the aid of spells or mediums, by table turning, or by automatic writing. As I have already said, I believe that genuine spirits do occasionally manifest themselves at séances, but that when they do, the medium is quite as surprised at the manifestation as the sitters, and in no greater a degree, perhaps, responsible for it. I believe the spirit I have named neutrarian is the only type of spirit that takes advantage of a séance. That is to say, takes advantage of the peculiar magnetic atmosphere created at a séance. It adopts the form or attributes of some relative or friend of one of the sitters, and, thus disguised, manifests itself merely for the sake of deceiving and misleading over-credulous men and women. But unfortunately these spirits do not stop at mere mischief. Having once gained a footing, so to speak, they can attach themselves to certain people, and by tormenting them continually, drive them in the end to madness and suicide. In addition to the danger of attracting undesirable neutrarians at séances, there is the risk of being duped by mediums. I have met a good many professional mediums, so-called clairvoyants, aura tellers, psychometrists, materializing mediums, and the like, and none of them have convinced me that they can do all that they profess to do. Besides, even if they could, the mere suggestion that one's spirit friend or relative is tapping on a wall or blowing through a trumpet, presumably to satisfy the curiosity of a number of strangers, and incidentally to fill the coffers of an illiterate man or woman, only fills one with disgust. If any departed friends of mine wish to visit me, I am sure they could do so without the assistance of a so-called medium and all their paltry paraphernalia. The usual argument in defense of these mediums is that some well-known scientific man believes in them. "If Sir Somebody or other says I am genuine," the clairvoyant exclaims, "then I am genuine, and you've no right in the world to doubt me." The medium is wrong. I have every right. Scientists may be very shrewd, perhaps infallible in their own legitimate calling, but outside it, their opinion need carry no more weight than mine, or yours, or anyone else's. It by no means follows that because a man is a professor of physics, he is also a great student of character. Poring over chemicals or figures all day is a very poor training for reading the human mind. An actor is a far more able exponent of psychology than any chemist or mathematician, and this being so, it is the actor who should play a prominent part in psychical research and not the scientist. If a veteran actor were to say to me, "Look here, I have watched that woman very carefully when she was supposed to go into a trance, and to speak in an entirely different voice from her own, and I am convinced she is merely acting," I should be inclined to believe him. In his wide experience of facial expression, posing, and assumed voices, it would be comparatively easy for him to tell whether the medium was shamming or not. A clever actress can disguise her voice effectually, and no one would know it. She can speak with a French accent one moment, and broad Cockney the next, and so naturally that few people would know that she was the same person. That is why, when I have listened to a clairvoyant, in an alleged trance, speaking in the voice of Tommy Jones or some other presumed obsessing spirit, I have been unmoved. There are a dozen actresses of my acquaintance who could easily do the same. But someone exclaims, "She actually spoke in Russian, a language she knows nothing about." "How do you know she is unacquainted with Russian?" is my answer. No one could possibly tell that but herself. She has most likely acquired a smattering of it simply for this purpose. What could be easier? I have a smattering of a good many languages, but I could easily stimulate complete ignorance of any one or all of them. I repeat, no one knows but ourselves how much we have seen and read and heard, where we have been and what we have studied, and, if we are sufficiently clever, we can let the outside world know just as much as we want it to know, and no more. Some mediums are said to act in one manner when they are obsessed, and in an entirely different manner when in their normal condition. What futile rubbish! Who knows when they are in their normal condition, or what their normal condition really is? Most of us are complex. I myself have several distinct personalities, and I defy anyone to enumerate them, any one of which might be equally my normal self. Moreover, I might go into a trance, speak with the voice of a Spaniard, and behave like a Red Indian, and those who saw me would think me obsessed. Yet they might easily be mistaken. I might have secretly acquired a smattering of Spanish, and one of my hobbies might be that of imitating, in private, the ways and habits of a Sioux or Crowfoot. I know a clergyman who attracts large congregations by reason of his eloquence and apparent piety, and who is believed in his parish to be most moral and sincere. I also know him to spend several evenings a week in an East End tavern, singing ribald songs and playing poker. Which is his true self? Which his normal condition? His congregation believe him to be one thing, his East End cronies another, and he is apparently quite as much at home in the church as he is in the tavern. Then, apart from the question of personalities, I believe another evidence of trickery lies in the non-usefulness of any of the communications alleged to be made by the spirits. If professional mediums could receive bona fide communications from the other world, I am quite sure that they would acquire some knowledge of a practical nature, and that we should, in consequence, soon see them all multi-millionaires. That they are not all Vanderbilts and Rothschilds is, I think, a very strong argument that their alleged spirit friends have told them nothing. And that is what it all amounts to, nothing. Automatic writing, table turning, and trances have taught us absolutely nothing concerning either this or the other world, and the messages purporting to come from the spirits have hitherto, at all events, consisted of trivialities and commonplaces of such an unedifying nature that we cannot dissociate them from factory girls and nursemaids. Our friends on the other side, who have passed through the valley of the shadow of death, might reasonably be expected to know something that we do not, and yet not even the smallest fragment of their knowledge has so far been transmitted to us through any of the channels resorted to by spiritualists. Neither, as far as I know, have the police benefited by any information imparted to them by mediums or automatic writers. On the other hand, although the unknown has refused to confide to those claiming to be its chosen few any messages that would right the wrong, bona fide phantasms of the dead have certainly been known to appear spontaneously to other than professional mediums with this intent. I am acquainted with an old lady who tells me that she often talks with Charles Dickens, Napoleon Bonaparte, Cardinal Newman, and other eminents. I have inquired how, and she has reluctantly admitted that the spirits of these eminents come to her at a séance conducted by a professional medium, who of course is paid very liberally for her services. The medium, I gather, sits behind a screen, where she is supposed to wait until she is obsessed. When everything is ready, she glides out, and in a voice purporting to be that of Napoleon, or of someone equally distinguished, she converses with this foolish and conceited old lady. It seems incredible that anyone outside a lunatic asylum could believe that the spirits of such great men as Napoleon, Newman, and Dickens should take the trouble to obsess a medium in order to chat with some non-entity who is neither extraordinarily clever nor particularly interesting. And yet there are dozens of people, apart from the old lady I have mentioned, who know so little of genius and eminence, and even ordinary talent, as to believe this incongruous happening to be possible. I myself have heard a spiritualist who lays down the laws respecting the unknown as if he were actually the creator, declare that, whenever he lectures, the hall is full to overflowing with spirits. Amongst them, he says, are the shades of Charles Dickens. There must be at least 100 shades of Dickens, for there is hardly a spiritualistic meeting or séance that I hear of at which Dickens is not alleged to be present. Sir Isaac Newton and Napoleon. Soon, perhaps, there will be the Kaiser and the Crown Prince. I hope so. Family séances are, of course, quite another matter. I have not the least doubt that when the friends and relatives of some departed person meet together, and concentrating very earnestly on that dead one being present, create the right magnetic atmosphere, that sometimes a real spirit manifestation does take place, and the phantasm of the deceased, or what at any rate purports to be the phantasm of the deceased, does actually appear. The phenomenon may possibly be a neutrarian, for of course there is always that risk, or it may really be the soul, spirit, or whatever else we like to call it, of the dead person. And here let me urge again the utter absurdity of attempting to dogmatize on the unknown. At one time it was the parson who unfolded to us, with all the sageness of one who had been there, the mysteries of the other world. He not only told us what we must do and not do in order to ascend to heaven, but he went a step further. He told us what heaven was like, and what actually was taking place there. The parson of today, however, does not seem quite so sure of his knowledge on these points as he was formerly, and his statements have become far less assertive. Indeed, they have become somewhat tentative. It is the occultist now who dictates. He talks with an air of absolute authority of astral planes, elementaries, elementals, vitalized shells, karmas, and goodness knows what besides, and uses such a variety of highfalutin terms that our brains at last become bewildered, and we begin to wonder with Goldsmith how it is possible that one small head can carry all he knows. But when we have boiled it all down, when we have analyzed his dissertation, we find that it is, in the last resort, merely a repetition of all the old doctrines with which we have been familiar from our earliest youth. The only difference is that our occultist, chiefly by discarding the old names of dogmas and adopting a superfluity of new ones, has made of these same doctrines a hotchpotch of such rare quality that few, if any, of us can digest it. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. 20 Years' Experience as a Ghost Hunter by Elliott O'Donnell. Chapter 12, A Haunted Mine in Wales. When I was at Brixton, paying daily visits to various well-known theatrical agencies in search of work, I ran across the manager of a fit-up company who wanted a man of about my age and build to play second lead in a melodrama. I closed with his offer, and for the next 4 weeks, which was as long as his funds held out, I paid 3 night visits to various towns in Wales, winding up at Llandudno, no better off financially than when I commenced, and having to pay my own fare back to London. If, however, my excursion into Wales was unprofitable from the monetary standpoint, it was by no means lacking in other respects, for, apart from the experience I gained from playing 4 entirely different parts a night, with 2 electric changes, I came across several interesting cases of hauntings. One of my landladies, a kindly old soul to whom I had chatted about ghosts, introduced me to an old man, Clem Morgan, whom she said had had a curious experience in one of the neighbouring mines. The incident had taken place some 50 years ago, shortly after a dreadful explosion, whereby many scores of the miners had been killed and injured. I will narrate the experience, merely altering the wording of it here and there, just as Clem Morgan narrated it to me. 1,000 feet down, close to the site of the great tragedy that had thrilled the whole country to the very core, my mate and I were at work. Pick, pick, pick. Shovel, shovel, shovel. The sound of our instruments must have been heard hundreds of yards away. "George," I said suddenly, leaving off work, "was it like this afore the accident?" "Like what?" George grunted. He was a middle-aged man with a black stubby beard and arms like the gnarled and knotted branches of an oak. "Like what?" "Why, as lonely as this. Were you working with just one other man, or were you with the rest of the gang?" "With one other," George responded, "and just as soft as you, Why can't you let the matter drop? I'm sick to death of hearing about it." "It's a marvel to me how you escaped," I went on. "Whereabouts were you?" "Just where we are now," George growled. "And that's all I'll tell you, so you'd best shut up." "And you went up them steps with all the hell of the explosion ringing around you?" I observed, advancing to the edge of the black shaft close to where we were working, and looking at the slender wooden ladder leading up to the dark vault above. "It's a wonder to me you didn't miss your footing in your hurry and fall. I should have done." "I've no doubt you would," George sneered, "but I'm no tenderfoot. I was at this game when you were in your cradle, which you ought never to have left." "How many feet down is it?" I went on, peering below me, much fascinated. 14 fathoms. We don't reckon by feet here. Done with that way of doing things in the schoolroom." "So that you would be killed outright if you fell?" "Try and see," George jeered. "It's my brother I was thinking of, not myself," I observed. "Where was he exactly when the explosion took place?" "How can I say, boy?" George replied irritably. "I don't know where half the folk are." "They told me he was in an adit leading into the main shaft." "He may have been, for all I know, and for all I care," George answered gruffly. "Do you suppose it was here he was working?" I said, after a moment or two's pause, during which I again went to the shaft and peered down. "This is not the only adit on the main," George growled. "He wasn't here, leastwise not when I was." "I heard he was with a man he unintentionally injured, and who ever after bore him a grudge." "Oh, oh!" George exclaimed. "So you know as much as that, do you? And what, pray, was this man like?" "I couldn't say," I replied, "excepting that he was much older than Dick, and very ugly." "A description that would fit in with dozens down here. If he was working with your brother and your brother was killed, the odds are he was killed too." "You think so?" "It seems reasonable enough, don't it?" George said. "He might have escaped like you did." "He might," George laughed, "just in the same way as pigs might fly. Supposing you get on with your work and let me do the same." "I had a queer dream about that man," I went on. "Dreams, pooh! Who believes in dreams?" George said. "What was it?" "Why, I dreamed he had something to do with Dick's death and with the accident." "You had better tell the inspector," George sneered, "and maybe he'll alter his verdict. You seem to have been very fond of this brother of yours. You've done nothing but carp about him all the morning." "I was," I replied. "So were we all. He kept the home going for the last 6 years." "Kept the home going? Why, where was you?" "At college, studying for a teacher. I gave it up after his death." "A schoolmaster? Well, I'm blowed. Then you didn't see much of Dick?" "Only in the holidays." "And who told you about this fellow who was supposed to have had a spite against him?" "Mother." "It was your mother, was it? Only hearsay evidence after all. Well, they're both dead anyhow. Good and bad and good, all went together, in a moment, boy. What do they call you?"
"Clem."
"Well, Clem, get on with your shoveling for mercy's sake. I've had enough of talking to last me to the end of the week."
I took up my spade, and for the next hour there were no other sounds but the steady, mechanical pick, 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 and scrape, scrape, scrape. Every now and then George sprang aside, there was a crash, and a huge block of coal fell on the rocky floor, amid a blinding shower of dust. A fraction of a second later, and George would have been under it, his head a jelly. Yet the narrowness of his escape did not seem to affect him. He treated it with the utmost indifference, and, wiping away the smuts from his eyes, took up his pick and resumed his hitting. I regarded him in silent wonder. When the dinner hour arrived, I groped my way to one of the big galleries. The idea of eating alone with George did not appeal to me, and an hour later I set out on my way back. A terrible sense of isolation hung over that part of the mine whither I bent my steps. It was so far away from the other adits, so tremendously deep down, so alarmingly dark, so sepulchrally silent. Up above, in the fields, woods, valleys, even far away in the primitive parts of the world, one is never quite alone, for the voice of nature makes itself heard in the birds and insects. One knows one is in the midst of life, but here in the bowels of the earth, encased in the dead vegetation of a long-forgotten world, there is absolute, all-paramount stillness. 1,000 times stiller than the stillness of a closed sepulchre. As I pressed on, the crunching of my feet on the scattered fragments of coal awoke the echoes of the galleries, and I paused every now and then to listen in awe to the long reverberating echoes as they rolled around and round me. Once I nearly slipped. Another foot, and I would have plunged into a sable labyrinth, the cold draught from which wound itself round me and choked the air in my lungs. I drew back in horror, and clinging to the knobbly surface of the black wall by my side, pressed frantically forward. God, supposing I should ever lose my way down here, be left behind when all the men went home, what would become of me? The perspiration rose on my forehead at the bare idea of it. Presently, to my relief, the sound of picking fell on my ears, and an abrupt turn of the passage brought me within sight of George, who had already recommenced work. I hastened to his side, and picking up my shovel, began to make a neat stack of the rapidly accumulating chunks. "George," I said, after an emphatic silence, "why didn't you tell me it was you who was working along with Dick?" "So, you've been asking questions, have you?" George growled, without, however, showing the slightest inclination to leave off working. "Who told you?" "Jim and Harry Peters." "Well, and what of it?" "But why didn't you say so when I asked you?" "What odds if I had? It wouldn't have done you any good." "Did you have a quarrel with him?" "Did the boys tell you I had? Because if so, it's no my use saying anything." "But what did you say?" "No, Dick and me never had no quarrel." "Is that true?" "Gospel." After this there was another silence unbroken save by the monotonous handling of the implements. Then I suddenly uttered an ejaculation and pointed at my cap. It was lying on the ground some few feet from where we were working, close beneath a projecting block of coal, and it was moving as if it were being violently agitated by something inside it. "What is it?" I demanded. "What is what?" George growled, resting for a moment on the handle of his pick. "Why, that," I said, pointing to my cap. "What makes it move like that?" "The wind, of course," George said. "There's not enough draft for that. See?" I placed a piece of paper on the ground within an inch or two of the cap, and it remained perfectly still. "Something must be underneath it." I picked the cap up. There was nothing there. "What do you think of it now?" I asked. George made no reply. He turned round so that I could not see his face, and plied his pick vigorously. After a few minutes I stopped work again. "George," I cried, "what's the matter with your coat? Look, it's doing just as your cap did." George threw down his pick with an oath. "What do you want to keep worrying me for?" he said. "What's wrong now?" Why, your coat. Look, it's moving. Rising up and down as if the wind were blowing it, and there's not an atom of draught. It's your fancy, George said hoarsely. The coat's not moving. What? I cried. Do you mean to say you can't see it moving? No, George replied. It's not, I tell you. And picking up his tool, he set to work again, even more vigorously than before. Some minutes later, I again stopped. Heavens, I exclaimed, look at my lamp. It's burning blue. What makes it do that? George paused, his pick shoulder high, and looked round. Nonsense, he said savagely. You are— Then he left off and his jaws dropped. It must be some chemical in it, he stammered. Let the damn thing be. It'll soon right itself. This is a strange place, George, I said slowly. Why strange? George snapped. Well, first of all, there was my cap, then your coat, and now the lantern, all doing something queer. Have you ever known the likes of it before? Often, George muttered. Scores of times. Funny things is always happening below ground. You'll get used to them in time. And yet you look a bit scared. Do I? George grunted. Well, I'm not. I'm not. You can't always judge by looks, you know. And raising his pick, he attacked the coal furiously. The afternoon was now waning. Outside, away on the top, where the only roof was the heavens, the sun had sunk to the level of the pine trees, from whose straight and gently swaying bodies the grotesque shadows of the night were beginning to steal. It is a peculiarity of the minds that, however deep down they may be, they yet feel the influence of time, and the departure of the sunlight from above creates an immediate increase in the gloom below. On this afternoon in particular, I felt the change acutely. A darkness that did not seem to be merely the darkness due to time stole down the pit's mouth and permeated adits, shafts, galleries, everywhere and everything. My light was still burning blue, but beyond it, down in the great gaping chasm, not 10 feet from him, and away along the narrow winding passage separating me from the rest of the gang, all was black, a denser black than I had conceived possible. I was staring around, too fascinated to go on with my work, when something icy cold gripped my fingers, and, looking down, I saw a big white hand lying on top of mine. I gave a yell and dropped my shovel, whereupon the hand vanished. "What's the matter now, curse you?" George said angrily. "If you keep on hindering me like this, I'll tell the overseer. See if I don't." "The place is haunted," I gasped. "A hand caught hold of mine just now." "A hand! Rot! What next? Ha!" And George forced a laugh. "I'm certain it was a hand," I said, "and it had a ring on like my brother Dick's." "You've got Dick on the brain, which is only natural, seeing that you was fond of him, and he only just dead. In a few days' time you will get over it and laugh at your present fears. There's no hands here but yours and mine, lad." "Aren't there?" I said quietly. "Then what is that just below yours on the pick?" George looked down. Instead of 2 hands, his own 2 hands, on the pick, there were 3, and the third was white and luminous. With a shriek, George dropped the pick and sprang away from it, as if it had been a serpent. "Do you believe me now?" I remarked. "If that wasn't Dick's hand, I've never seen it. Besides, I could swear to his ring among 1,000. Have you noticed how dark it has been getting?" "I've noticed nothing," George muttered, picking up his tool. "It's all your talk that has done it. You've upset my nerves." He raised his pick and began to work again. but his hand shook so much he struck his leg and dropped the implement with a cry of pain. "It's nothing," he growled, as I sprang to his side. "Only the skin grazed, but I reckon I'll sit down a bit. I'm all of a tremble." He had moved nearer to the edge of the pit, and was about to sit down with his back towards it, when I cried, "My God, there's Dick! He's just behind you! He's pointing at you, George! I see it all now! George, you devil! You murdered him!" George looked round, and there, bending over him, was a tall figure with a strangely white face. He threw out his hands to keep the figure off, and as he did so he slipped and fell, with one loud yell of terror, into the pit. I heard him strike the side of the great abyss once, then thud. That was all. Sick at heart, I reeled back to the safety of the niche where we had been working, and as I did so my eyes fell on the lamp. The flame was now white and normal. A rescue party that went in search of George found him in a dying condition at the bottom of the shaft. The fact that he was not killed outright was due to his having fallen in a foot or two of mud and water, which had somewhat broken the force of the concussion. He was fatally injured, but he lingered just long enough to confess that he, and he only, was to blame for the recent disaster. He had had a violent quarrel with Dick, whom he had hated, and when Dick's back was turned, he had struck him over the head with his pick and killed him. Seized with horror, he then dragged Dick's body into the passage, and, in order to minimize the risk of discovery, had saturated it with paraffin and set fire to it. He had had just time enough to reach the ladder leading up from the shaft and climb up it before the explosion had taken place. The Welsh miners are at times magnanimous, and on this occasion they agreed to keep George's crime a secret. To give publicity to the affair, they argued, would not give them back the relatives they had lost, and would only do harm to the dead man's widow and family, who were left almost penniless. Thus the matter ended, and to the outside world the cause of the explosion remained, as before, a mystery. Of course, it may be said of this case that it has no great value from the evidential point of view, no one having witnessed the ghostly happening but Morgan and the man who was subsequently killed. This may be. At the same time, much depends upon the character of a witness, and the evidence of one man who is reliable is surely worth more than the evidence of several men who are not reliable. Morgan told his story in a simple, straightforward manner, and I believed him. End of chapter 12.